People stop looking at a man the moment they think he has nothing left worth saving. Caleb Turner used to say that line like a joke whenever somebody asked why he always sat alone at the far end of Rosie's Diner outside Amarillo, Texas. But on the cold November morning the German Shepherd appeared beside his truck. He realized the words were not funny anymore, because nobody inside the diner had even noticed he was gone for almost an hour. The wind rolled hard across the empty highway, carrying dust and dead leaves through the cracked gas station parking lot, while Caleb stood beside his faded blue Ford pickup, rubbing warmth back into his stiff hands. At 58 years old, with silver stubble covering his jaw and deep lines around pale blue eyes that always looked more tired than angry, he had learned how invisible a man could become after enough years passed without anybody calling his name. The truck stop smelled like diesel fuel, black coffee, and cold rain drifting down from the northern plains, and somewhere beyond the rows of parked 18-wheelers a lonely train horn echoed across the flat Texas landscape. Caleb pulled his denim jacket tighter against the freezing wind and reached into his pocket for the small photograph he carried everywhere, the corners worn soft from years of folding and unfolding. In the picture, his daughter Lily smiled beside a lake in Colorado, sunlight catching her blonde hair while she held up a fishing rod almost taller than she was. Caleb stared at the photograph for a few quiet seconds before sliding it back into his wallet, because some memories hurt worse when the weather turned cold. That was when he heard the low sound behind him. Not a growl. Not exactly a bark either. More like the cautious breath of something exhausted from running too long alone. Caleb turned slowly and saw the German Shepherd standing near the edge of the parking lot beside an overflowing trash can. The dog was large, with thick black and tan fur damp from melting frost, intelligent amber eyes fixed directly on him without fear. One ear stood upright while the other bent slightly at the tip, giving the animal a strangely human expression, like somebody trying not to show disappointment. The dog looked thin but not wild, tired but still proud. Caleb glanced around the empty lot expecting somebody to whistle for him, but nobody came. Cars moved along the interstate half a mile away while the truck stop neon sign buzzed overhead, yet somehow the world around them felt completely still. "You lost, buddy?" Caleb asked quietly. The shepherd didn't move. Caleb crouched slowly despite the ache in his knees and held out part of the sausage biscuit he had wrapped in a napkin from breakfast. For a moment the dog remained frozen against the wind, watching him carefully like trust itself had become dangerous, then finally stepped forward one cautious paw at a time. Caleb noticed an old leather collar hidden beneath the thick fur, but there was no tag attached anymore, only a broken metal ring swinging softly against the dog's neck. The shepherd stopped inches away and gently took the food from Caleb's hand, without snapping or rushing. Up close, Caleb could see fresh mud caked along the animal's legs, as if he had traveled miles through rough country to reach this place. The dog lifted his head again, staring directly into Caleb's eyes with an intensity that made the older man forget the freezing air around them. Something inside that silent stare felt familiar, like looking into the eyes of another soul that had spent too much time abandoned by the world. Caleb exhaled slowly and scratched behind the shepherd's ears while the cold Texas wind howled across the empty highway behind them. Caleb stayed crouched beside the German Shepherd for several long seconds while the freezing wind pushed across the truck stop parking lot hard enough to rattle the loose metal sign above the diner entrance. The dog finished the last bite of sausage biscuit carefully, almost politely, then sat down beside him without making a sound. Caleb could not remember the last time another living thing had chosen to stay near him without wanting something in return. He rubbed the shepherd's neck gently and felt the cold dampness trapped deep beneath the thick fur. "You have been out here a while, have you not?" he muttered quietly. The dog blinked slowly but never looked away from him. Somewhere across the highway a tractor-trailer blasted its horn while rolling through the gray morning fog, yet the shepherd did not flinch at the noise. Caleb noticed that immediately. Most stray dogs startled easy around loud engines and sudden movement, but this one carried himself differently, calm and alert like he had spent years learning how to stay steady under pressure. Caleb stood carefully, his lower back tightening the way it always did during cold weather, and motioned toward the diner door. "Come on then. I cannot leave you freezing out here." To his surprise, the dog followed beside him instantly, matching his pace step for step across the cracked pavement. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as Caleb entered the warmth inside. A few truckers sat scattered among the booths drinking coffee beneath yellow fluorescent lights, while an old country song played low through dusty ceiling speakers. The smell of bacon grease and cinnamon pancakes wrapped around Caleb the moment he stepped inside. But what caught everybody's attention was the German shepherd walking calmly beside him. A waitress named Jolene looked up from behind the counter and raised an eyebrow. "Well now," she said with a tired smile. "Looks like you made a friend." Caleb shrugged awkwardly, suddenly embarrassed by how much the comment affected him. "Found him outside." Jolene leaned forward over the counter to look at the dog more closely. "That is no stray. Somebody took care of that boy once." The shepherd remained pressed beside Caleb's leg, quiet and patient despite the unfamiliar room around him. One truck driver near the window whistled softly. "Beautiful dog. German shepherd, right?" Caleb nodded once. "Looks like it." Jolene disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned carrying a large plastic bowl filled with water and strips of plain grilled chicken on a plate. "How special," she joked while setting it down near the booth. The shepherd glanced up at Caleb first before touching the food, almost waiting for permission. Caleb felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest at the sight. "Go ahead, buddy." The dog lowered his head and began eating slowly while Caleb slid into the booth beside him. Outside the diner windows, snow clouds continued gathering across the Texas sky, darkening the morning light until everything beyond the glass looked cold and distant. Caleb wrapped both hands around a fresh mug of black coffee while watching the shepherd finish every piece of chicken. The dog finally rested beneath the table afterward, placing one paw across Caleb's worn boot as though they had known each other much longer than 20 minutes. Caleb stared down at the animal in silence. It had been years since another heartbeat beside his own made the world feel less empty. The snow finally started falling just after noon, light flakes drifting across the diner windows, while Caleb sat quietly in the corner booth finishing his third cup of coffee. The German shepherd remained stretched beside him on the worn tile floor, calm enough that several customers had stopped staring and gone back to their own conversations. Every once in a while the dog lifted his head whenever somebody entered through the front door, his amber eyes watching carefully before relaxing again. Caleb noticed the habit each time. The shepherd was waiting for someone, or maybe hoping. Jolene returned carrying a fresh pot of coffee and slid into the opposite side of the booth without asking. "You planning to keep him?" she asked softly while pouring more into Caleb's mug. Caleb stared out the window toward the interstate where snow now coated the shoulders of the road in pale white streaks. "I do not even know if he belongs to somebody nearby." Jolene nodded slowly. "Maybe, but dogs like that do not usually wander off without a reason." Caleb looked down at the shepherd again. Up close, he could see faint gray around the dog's muzzle, signs that the animal was no longer young either. There was experience in those eyes. Weariness too. The kind that came from spending too long searching for something that never came back. "I had one years ago," Caleb said quietly after a moment. Jolene looked surprised. "A shepherd?" Caleb nodded once. "Back when Lily was little. His name was Ranger." The memory pulled at him, unexpectedly hard. He could still picture summer evenings outside their old house near Denver, Lily throwing tennis balls across the yard while Ranger chased after them endlessly through the grass. Back then the world had seemed stable somehow, like the good parts of life would stay where they belonged forever. But years changed things slowly until one day everything familiar became something distant you could barely touch anymore. Caleb swallowed against the tightness in his throat and forced a tired smile. She loved that dog more than anything. Jolene rested her elbows against the table. "Where is your daughter now?" Caleb's fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. He waited several seconds before answering. "Seattle." Jolene seemed to notice immediately there was more to the story than the single word he gave her. She did not press further. Outside, the snow thickened harder against the parking lot while truck engines rumbled beneath the darkening afternoon sky. The shepherd suddenly stood up beside the booth and walked toward the front entrance, ears alert. Caleb watched as the dog stopped near the glass doors, staring outside with complete focus. A silver pickup had just pulled into the lot. For one brief second, hope crossed the animal's face so clearly that Caleb felt it like a punch in his chest. The driver stepped out wearing a brown ranch jacket and crossed quickly into the diner, without even glancing toward the shepherd. The dog remained frozen by the door another few moments before lowering his head slightly and returning to Caleb's side in silence. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears gently. "Yeah," he murmured softly, understanding more than he wanted to admit. "I know what that feels like." The shepherd leaned against his leg afterward, heavy and warm, while snow continued falling across the empty Texas highway beyond the diner windows. By late afternoon, the storm had swallowed most of the highway outside Amarillo, covering the truck stop in blowing snow and freezing wind strong enough to shake the diner windows every few minutes. Caleb finally stood from the booth with a tired groan, reaching for his wallet while the German shepherd rose instantly beside him. The dog had not left his side once during the last several hours. Jolene watched them from behind the register with her arms folded. "Road conditions are getting ugly," she warned. State Patrol already shut down part of Interstate 40 westbound. Caleb nodded slowly. "I only plan to drive another 40 miles tonight anyway." Jolene glanced down at the shepherd. "And what about him?" Caleb hesitated. That question had been sitting quietly in the back of his mind since the moment the dog walked into the diner beside him. He was staying at a cheap roadside motel outside Tucumcari, New Mexico, the kind with thin walls, flickering lights, and management that barely tolerated people, much less animals. Still, when Caleb looked down into the shepherd's calm amber eyes, the idea of leaving him outside in the storm felt impossible. "I guess he rides with me until we figure something out," Caleb finally answered. Jolene smiled softly like she had expected that answer all along. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out an old red flannel blanket folded neatly into a square. "Take this then. Nights are dropping below 20 degrees. Caleb accepted it carefully. "I appreciate it." Outside, freezing wind slammed against them the moment they stepped from the diner. Snow swirled across the parking lot in white waves while truck engines rumbled low through the darkening evening. Caleb unlocked the passenger door of his faded Ford pickup and spread the blanket across the seat. The German shepherd jumped inside without hesitation, curling up immediately, as if he already understood this truck was temporary shelter from the storm. Caleb climbed behind the wheel and paused for a moment before starting the engine. The dashboard clock glowed 5:42 p.m. in faded green numbers, while an old country station crackled softly through the radio speakers. Snow tapped against the windshield in restless bursts. Caleb rested both hands on the steering wheel, but did not drive yet. It felt strange having another presence beside him after so many years alone on the road. Strange in a way that unsettled him because part of him had started getting used to the emptiness. The shepherd lifted his head slightly and watched him quietly. "You probably had a better life before this," Caleb muttered while the heater slowly pushed warm air into the cab. "Nice house. Family. Somebody calling your name every day." The dog blinked once, listening. Caleb gave a faint smile without humor. "Funny thing is, most people think losing happens all at once, like a car wreck or some terrible phone call. But sometimes it happens little by little. One missed birthday. One conversation that never gets returned. 1 year turning into 5 before you even notice." His voice grew quieter near the end. Outside, headlights passed through the storm like distant ghosts moving across the highway. Caleb finally shifted the truck into drive and eased slowly out of the parking lot. The shepherd stayed pressed against the passenger seat watching the falling snow while Amarillo disappeared behind them mile by mile beneath the dark Texas sky. The farther west they drove, the heavier the storm became. Snow swept across Interstate 40 in thick white sheets that blurred the lane markers and forced traffic to crawl through the darkness at barely 40 miles an hour. Caleb leaned forward slightly over the steering wheel, his tired eyes fixed on the narrow stretch of road illuminated by the truck headlights. Beside him, the German shepherd remained completely calm despite the weather, resting quietly on the red flannel blanket while warm air from the heater moved through his thick fur. Every once in a while the dog lifted his head and glanced toward Caleb, as if checking whether he was still holding together. Around 7 o'clock, Caleb pulled into a small gas station near the Texas and New Mexico border. The place looked nearly abandoned except for one rusted pickup parked beside the pumps and a flickering open sign glowing faintly through the snow. Caleb stepped outside into the freezing wind, instantly regretting it as cold air sliced through his denim jacket. The shepherd jumped down from the truck beside him and stayed close while Caleb filled the gas tank beneath the buzzing overhead lights. "You stick pretty close for a stray," Caleb muttered, while tightening the gas cap. The dog watched the empty highway silently, ears alert beneath the falling snow. Inside the station, an elderly cashier looked up from a small television playing weather updates near the counter. "Storm is only getting worse tonight," the man warned while Caleb paid for gas and grabbed a package of beef jerky along with 2 bottles of water. "They might shut the interstate down before midnight." Caleb nodded. "I am heading to Tucumcari." The cashier shook his head slowly. "If you make it that far, you are lucky." When Caleb returned outside, he found the German shepherd sitting patiently beside the truck exactly where he had left him, snow collecting along the dog's back in a thin white layer. Caleb opened the passenger door, and the shepherd climbed inside immediately before curling against the blanket again. The simple trust in that movement hit Caleb harder than he expected. He had spent years drifting from town to town doing temporary mechanic work, sleeping in roadside motels, and eating alone in diners where nobody remembered his name the next morning. Somewhere along the way, he stopped expecting company. Stopped expecting loyalty too. As they pulled back onto the highway, the radio signal faded in and out beneath the storm until only static remained. Caleb drove in silence for several miles before speaking again. "Lily used to talk about getting another shepherd someday," he said quietly, mostly to himself. After Ranger passed away, the dog's ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. Caleb swallowed hard before continuing. "She stopped calling much after her mother died. I guess grief hits everybody different." Snow hammered harder against the windshield now, while tractor trailers crawled ahead through the darkness, with flashing hazard lights glowing red through the storm. Caleb tightened both hands on the steering wheel. "Truth is, I probably made it easier for her to stay away," he admitted softly. "Some people do not know how to carry pain together, so they carry it alone instead." The German shepherd slowly rested his head against Caleb's arm, while the truck rolled west through the freezing New Mexico night, and for the first time in years, Caleb did not feel entirely alone inside the silence. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Caleb finally reached the outskirts of Tucumcari. Snow still drifted across the highway, but the storm had weakened enough for distant neon motel signs to glow through the darkness like tired beacons along the roadside. Caleb's shoulders ached from gripping the steering wheel for hours, and exhaustion settled deep behind his eyes. The German shepherd remained awake beside him, alert despite the long drive, watching every passing light with quiet focus. Caleb pulled into the parking lot of the Sunset Trails Motel, a weathered one-story place with faded turquoise doors and an ice machine that rattled loudly near the office. Half the parking spaces sat empty beneath the snow. Caleb killed the engine and rested both hands against the wheel for a moment, listening to the silence inside the truck cab. "Well," he sighed softly, "let us see if they throw us both out." The shepherd climbed down beside him as they crossed toward the motel office through freezing wind and crunchy snow. Inside, an old electric heater buzzed near the counter while a middle-aged woman wearing reading glasses looked up from a crossword puzzle. Her name tag read Donna. She glanced toward the dog first. "No pets," she said automatically before Caleb could even speak. Caleb nodded slowly, already expecting the answer. "He is quiet. Just for one night." Donna studied the shepherd carefully while the dog stood calmly beside Caleb, without pulling or barking. Finally, she lowered her crossword puzzle. "He looks cleaner than most people staying here lately." Caleb laughed faintly for the first time all day. Donna exhaled and slid a room key across the counter. "Room 12. Keep him off the beds, and we will pretend this conversation never happened." "Thank you," Caleb said sincerely. Room 12 smelled faintly like old carpet and stale coffee, but it was warm. Caleb dropped his duffel bag near the door while the German shepherd slowly walked the perimeter of the small room, inspecting every corner before finally settling near the heater. Snow tapped softly against the window while headlights from passing trucks swept occasionally across the ceiling. Caleb removed his boots and sat heavily on the edge of the bed with a tired groan. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Then Caleb noticed the shepherd staring toward the nightstand. A folded Gideon Bible sat there beside a motel lamp along with a small notepad and pen. The dog's attention stayed fixed on the notepad. Caleb frowned slightly before reaching for it. Written across the top page in shaky blue ink were the words "call if found," followed by a phone number partially smeared by water damage. Caleb's heartbeat slowed. He leaned closer beneath the dim lamplight and turned the page carefully. On the second sheet, someone had written the name Max. Caleb looked toward the German shepherd immediately. "Max," he repeated quietly. The dog's ears lifted at once. Caleb stared at him in surprise. "That is your name?" The shepherd stood slowly and walked closer beside the bed, tail moving once against the floor. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest again, something painfully close to hope. "Well," he whispered, rubbing the dog gently behind the ears. "Looks like somebody was trying to find you after all." Outside, snow continued falling softly across the sleeping New Mexico town, while Caleb sat on the edge of the motel bed staring at the old phone number beneath the weak yellow lamplight, wondering whether calling it would return the dog to somebody waiting desperately for him, or take away the only good thing that had walked into Caleb's life in years. Caleb sat awake long after midnight with the motel lamp casting weak yellow light across the room, while Max slept beside the heater on the worn carpet. The folded paper with the phone number rested in Caleb's hands, its edges softened by time and water stains. He had already picked up the motel phone twice before setting it back down again. Something about making the call unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Maybe because returning Max meant accepting that this strange companionship was temporary. Maybe because part of him envied whoever the dog had once belonged to. Around 1 in the morning, Caleb finally exhaled slowly and dialed the number. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered with a tired voice thick from sleep. "Hello." Caleb hesitated for a second. "Ma'am, I am sorry to call this late. I found a German shepherd with this number attached to an old note in a motel room." Silence filled the line instantly. Then the woman spoke again, her voice suddenly sharper with emotion. "His name is Max." Caleb looked toward the sleeping dog. "Yes." Another long silence followed before the woman quietly said, "Oh my God." Caleb sat forward slightly on the edge of the bed. "You know him?" "He belonged to my father," she answered softly. "We lost him almost 4 months ago outside Albuquerque." Caleb frowned. "For months. Dad passed away in June." The woman continued carefully. "After that, Max disappeared from his property during a thunderstorm. We searched everywhere." Caleb glanced toward the shepherd again, trying to imagine the miles the dog might have traveled alone across desert highways and empty towns. "Where is your father's property?" "Near Santa Rosa, New Mexico," she said. "About 90 miles west of Tucumcari." Caleb's grip tightened slightly around the receiver. The dog had crossed an incredible distance by himself. The woman's voice softened again. "Is he okay?" Caleb looked at Max, sleeping peacefully against the heater vent, one paw stretched across the red flannel blanket from Jolene's diner. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "He is tired, but he is okay." The woman introduced herself as Emily Harper and explained that her father, Walter Harper, had been a retired railroad mechanic who lived alone with Max after his wife died years earlier. According to Emily, the dog had barely left Walter's side during his final months. Dad used to say Max understood silence better than people did, she said with a faint laugh that sounded dangerously close to tears. Caleb swallowed hard at the words because somehow they felt true. "Would you like me to bring him tomorrow?" he asked gently. Emily paused before answering. "I would appreciate that more than you know." After the call ended, Caleb remained seated quietly beside the motel window while snow drifted beneath the parking lot lights outside. Something heavy settled inside his chest, though he could not fully explain why. Maybe because hearing about Walter Harper felt uncomfortably familiar. Another aging man. Another lonely life slowly shrinking smaller after loss. Another person whose closest companion had been a German shepherd lying faithfully beside him through the silence. Caleb rubbed both hands across his tired face before finally standing. Max lifted his head immediately when Caleb approached. "Looks like we are taking a trip tomorrow, buddy," Caleb whispered softly. The shepherd stared at him with calm amber eyes while the old motel heater hummed through the quiet room. And somewhere deep inside himself, Caleb realized he was already dreading goodbye. Morning arrived gray and silent over Tucumcari. Fresh snow covered the motel parking lot in smooth, untouched layers, while pale sunlight struggled through thick winter clouds above New Mexico. Caleb stood outside room 12 holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee, as cold air drifted across the empty highway nearby. Max sat beside him calmly, his thick fur glowing softly beneath the weak morning light. For several seconds, Caleb simply stared west toward the open road stretching across the frozen desert. 90 miles. That was all separating the dog from the family still waiting for him. Yet the closer that moment came, the heavier Caleb's chest felt. Inside the truck cab, the heater rattled loudly as they drove out of Tucumcari beneath a pale winter sky. Snow still covered the shoulders of the road, though the storm itself had passed during the night, leaving behind long, empty stretches of icy highway and distant mesas glowing faintly orange beneath the morning sun. Max remained seated upright in the passenger seat, watching the landscape carefully, as though some part of him recognized the direction they were heading. Caleb noticed how alert the shepherd had become since sunrise. "You know where we are going, do you not?" he asked quietly. Max glanced toward him briefly before returning his attention to the road ahead. Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah, I figured." The miles passed slowly beneath the tires while old country songs drifted through the radio static. Caleb found himself talking more than usual during the drive, speaking into the silence the way lonely people sometimes do when they finally stop pretending they are fine. He told Max about the garage he once owned outside Denver before the recession forced him to sell it. He talked about Lily learning to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot near their old neighborhood. He even admitted how badly he handled things after his wife Claire died from cancer 8 years earlier. "I thought shutting everybody out would make it easier somehow," Caleb confessed while gripping the steering wheel loosely. "Turns out loneliness grows faster when you feed it." Max listened quietly beside him, calm and steady like he understood every word. Around noon, they turned off the interstate onto a narrow two-lane road leading toward Santa Rosa. Snow-covered fields stretched endlessly beneath the brightening sky while old wooden fences cut across the landscape in crooked lines. Eventually, Caleb spotted a small ranch house sitting alone near a cluster of cottonwood trees with a rusted mailbox beside the driveway reading Harper in faded black letters. The moment the truck slowed near the property, Max suddenly stood upright in the seat. His ears lifted sharply and his entire body became tense with recognition. Caleb felt his own throat tighten immediately. "Easy, buddy," he whispered softly while pulling into the driveway. Before the engine fully stopped, the front door of the ranch house swung open. A woman in her early 40s hurried outside wearing a thick winter coat, her blonde hair blowing across her face in the cold wind. Behind her came 2 children, a teenage boy and a little girl no older than 8. Max let out the first bark Caleb had heard from him since Amarillo. It echoed across the frozen property, full of joy so sudden and pure that Caleb felt it straight through his chest. The shepherd leaped from the truck the second Caleb opened the door and sprinted through the snow toward the family waiting near the porch. Emily Harper dropped to her knees instantly as Max reached her, wrapping both arms around the dog while tears rolled freely down her face beneath the winter sunlight. Caleb remained standing beside his truck while the Harper family surrounded Max in the snow-covered yard. The German shepherd moved between them excitedly, pressing against Emily and the 2 children as though he had spent every day of the last 4 months trying to find his way back to this exact moment. The little girl wrapped both arms around Max's neck while laughing through tears, and even the teenage boy, who clearly wanted to appear older and tougher, kept wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket. Caleb felt warmth spread quietly through his chest watching the reunion, yet underneath it sat the familiar ache of knowing he no longer belonged there. Emily finally stood and walked toward him across the snow with tears still shining in her eyes. "I do not even know how to thank you," she said softly. "We thought we would never see him again." Caleb glanced toward Max, playing beside the children near the porch. "Looks like he never stopped trying to come home." Emily nodded slowly. "That sounds exactly like my father." She invited Caleb inside for coffee before he continued his drive west, and after a moment of hesitation he accepted. The ranch house smelled like pine wood, cinnamon, and old photographs. Family pictures covered nearly every wall, many of them showing an older gray-haired man smiling beside Max through different seasons and years. In one photo, Walter Harper stood holding a fishing pole beside a mountain lake while Max sat proudly at his feet. In another, the dog rested beside Walter on the front porch during sunset. Caleb found himself studying those pictures longer than expected because there was something deeply familiar in the quiet bond between the old man and the shepherd. Emily noticed. Dad rescued Max from an animal shelter about 7 years ago. She explained while pouring coffee into heavy ceramic mugs. After Mom passed away, those two became inseparable. Caleb nodded gently. I understand that. They sat together at the kitchen table while Max rested nearby, with one paw touching the little girl's boot as if making sure she was real. Sunlight drifted through the frosted windows now, turning the kitchen golden against the cold New Mexico afternoon outside. Emily stirred cream into her coffee slowly before speaking again. Dad used to say something strange about Max, she said. He believed dogs could recognize loneliness before people admitted it to themselves. Caleb gave a quiet laugh under his breath because the words struck too close to home. Emily studied him carefully across the table. You have that same look Dad carried near the end, she said softly. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the coffee mug in his hands. Life gets quieter when you get older. Emily nodded with understanding instead of pity, and somehow that made it easier to breathe. After a while, she reached into a nearby drawer and removed a small leather collar with a polished silver tag attached. Dad bought this before Max disappeared, she explained. We never got the chance to put it on him. She handed the collar carefully to Caleb. Engraved beneath Max's name were the words, "Find your way home." Caleb stared at the tag silently, while emotion tightened unexpectedly in his throat. Outside the kitchen window, snow melted slowly beneath pale winter sunlight, dripping from the ranch roof in steady drops. Max eventually stood and walked over beside Caleb's chair, resting his head gently against the older man's knee. Caleb scratched behind the shepherd's ears one more time, already feeling the weight of goodbye approaching faster than he wanted. The afternoon passed more slowly than Caleb expected. Emily insisted he stay for an early dinner before continuing west, and for the first time in years Caleb found himself sitting at a crowded family table instead of eating alone beside a motel television or inside a roadside diner booth. The kitchen filled with the smell of roast chicken, warm bread, and coffee while sunlight faded softly beyond the frosted ranch windows. Max stayed close to Caleb through most of the evening, even though the shepherd was finally home again. Every time Caleb shifted in his chair, the dog lifted his head immediately, as though making certain he had not disappeared. Emily's daughter Sophie eventually noticed it too. I think Max likes you, she said with a smile while feeding the dog small pieces of carrot beneath the table. Caleb scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. I think he just feels sorry for old men who drive bad trucks. Sophie laughed while Max rested his head against Caleb's knee again. Across the table, Emily watched quietly before speaking. Dad used to say dogs remember who shows up during hard days. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the silverware in front of him because something about those words landed deeper than he wanted anyone to notice. After dinner, Emily showed him Walter Harper's workshop behind the ranch house. The small building smelled like cedar wood, machine oil, and old leather. Tools still hung neatly on the walls exactly where Walter had left them. A worn radio sat near the workbench beside stacks of railroad magazines and faded photographs. Max walked through the workshop slowly beside Caleb, pausing near an old recliner in the corner. Caleb could almost picture Walter sitting there late at night while the shepherd slept at his feet. Dad spent most evenings out here, Emily explained softly from the doorway. After Mom died, this became his quiet place. Caleb nodded without speaking. He understood that kind of silence better than most people did. Emily stepped closer after a moment and handed Caleb a framed photograph she had pulled from the shelf above the workbench. The picture showed Walter Harper sitting on the ranch porch, smiling beside Max during sunset. The old man looked weathered but peaceful, the kind of face shaped by years of hard work and private grief carried with dignity. Caleb stared at the photograph longer than expected. He looked like a good man, he finally said. Emily smiled faintly. He was lonely, she answered honestly. But yes, he was good. Those words stayed with Caleb long after the conversation ended because loneliness and goodness often existed side by side more than people liked admitting. As evening settled across the ranch, Caleb knew it was time to leave. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the roof while cold wind rolled across the darkening fields outside. Caleb grabbed his duffel bag from the truck and turned toward the porch where Max waited. Beside the family, the shepherd looked at Caleb carefully, ears slightly lowered. Caleb crouched slowly despite the ache in his knees and rubbed both hands along the dog's thick neck fur. "You made it home, buddy," he whispered. "That is what matters." For a second, Max remained completely still beneath his hands. Then, unexpectedly, the dog pressed forward and rested his forehead gently against Caleb's chest. The simple gesture nearly broke something inside him. Caleb closed his eyes briefly while cold evening wind moved across the ranch yard around them. It had been a very long time since goodbye felt this difficult. Caleb finally climbed into his truck just after sunset, while the Harper family stood together near the porch beneath the cold New Mexico sky. The ranch windows glowed warm yellow against the growing darkness, and for a moment the entire scene looked like something pulled from another lifetime, the kind people spend years trying to find again after losing it once. Max remained beside the porch steps watching Caleb closely as the engine turned over with a rough growl. Caleb forced himself not to look too long because he already understood how dangerous attachment could become when you spend enough years alone. Emily stepped toward the driver's window before he pulled away and handed him a small paper bag. "For the road," she said softly. "And thank you again. More than you know." Caleb accepted the bag with a quiet nod. "Take care of him." Emily smiled gently. "You too." Caleb eased the truck slowly down the snowy driveway while Max stood motionless near the porch. In the rearview mirror, Caleb could still see the shepherd watching the truck disappear into the darkening landscape long after the ranch itself faded behind him. The highway felt emptier than before. The passenger seat beside Caleb now held only the folded red flannel blanket and a few strands of black and tan fur caught in the fabric. The silence inside the cab pressed heavier than it had 2 days earlier because now Caleb understood exactly what he was missing. He drove east through the freezing night, while old radio stations drifted in and out beneath static. Around an hour later, he pulled into a small roadside overlook near the interstate and shut off the engine. Cold wind rolled across the empty desert while distant headlights moved slowly along the highway below. Caleb opened the paper bag Emily had given him and found 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil along with a folded envelope carrying his name written neatly across the front. He frowned slightly before opening it beneath the dashboard light. Inside was a handwritten note. "Caleb, my father believed some people come into our lives for a reason, even if only briefly. I think Max found you because both of you needed somebody to remind you that home is still possible. You do not have to disappear from the world just because life became painful. Emily." Caleb stared at the note for a long time while wind rocked the truck gently beneath the dark sky. Eventually, he leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. He could still feel the weight of Max resting his head against his arm during the drive through the storm. Still hear Sophie laughing at the dinner table. Still see the photographs covering the Harper family walls. For years, Caleb had convinced himself isolation was easier than disappointment. But now the loneliness felt different somehow. Harder to defend. His phone rested on the dashboard beside the folded note. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Caleb picked it up and scrolled through old contacts until he found a number he had not called in over 8 months. Lily Turner. His thumb hovered uncertainly above the screen while memories flooded back all at once. Birthday cards unanswered, missed calls ignored. Too many years spent grieving separately instead of together. Caleb swallowed hard and looked out across the dark New Mexico desert. "You are getting old, Caleb," he muttered quietly to himself. "Maybe it is time to stop running." Before he could change his mind, he pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear while cold winter wind whispered softly across the empty highway outside. The phone rang 4 times before Caleb heard the soft click of somebody answering on the other end. For a second, neither of them spoke. All Caleb could hear was distant traffic somewhere far away, and the quiet sound of his daughter breathing into the silence. Then Lily finally said, "Dad." Her voice sounded older than he remembered, calmer somehow, but underneath it Caleb still recognized the same little girl who used to run barefoot across the backyard chasing Ranger through the summer grass. Caleb swallowed hard and stared out through the truck windshield at the empty New Mexico highway stretching beneath the cold stars. "Hey, kiddo," he answered quietly. Another long silence followed before Lily spoke again, softer this time. "I was starting to think you forgot my number." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "No," he admitted. "I just forgot how to call." He expected anger after that. Maybe resentment. Maybe the sharp distance that had grown between them over the years since Claire passed away. Instead, Lily let out a small, tired laugh that sounded painfully close to tears. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think we both did." Snow drifted lightly across the roadside overlook while Caleb leaned back against the worn truck seat, holding the phone carefully like something fragile. For the next hour, they talked more honestly than they had in years. Caleb told her about finding Max beside the diner outside Amarillo. He described the storm, the drive through Texas, and the Harper family waiting on the ranch porch when the shepherd finally came home. Lily listened quietly through most of it before finally saying, "Mom always believed animals found the people who needed them most." Caleb smiled faintly at the memory of Claire saying almost the exact same thing years earlier. "Your mother was smarter than both of us," he said. Lily laughed softly, and hearing that sound again after so many silent months made something inside Caleb loosen for the first time in years. Eventually, she told him about her life in Seattle, her work at the veterinary clinic, the small apartment overlooking Puget Sound, and how difficult the holidays had become after losing both parents in different ways. Caleb listened carefully because for too long he had stopped listening to anyone at all. "You know," Lily said after a while, "there is an empty room here." Caleb looked down at the folded red flannel blanket resting on the passenger seat beside him. "Seattle is a long drive." "You have driven farther already," she answered gently. Caleb laughed quietly under his breath while cold wind rocked the truck outside. Somewhere beyond the overlook, a freight train echoed across the desert night, low and lonely beneath the stars. He thought about Walter Harper sitting beside Max in the workshop after losing his wife. He thought about Emily's letter folded carefully inside his jacket pocket. Mostly he thought about how easy it had become to confuse isolation with strength. "Maybe I could stay a while," Caleb finally said. Lily did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked slightly with emotion. "I would really like that, Dad." Caleb sat there long after the call ended, staring across the frozen highway beneath the endless western sky. For the first time in years, the road ahead no longer felt empty. Somewhere out there, families were sleeping beside warm lights and familiar voices. Somewhere in Seattle, his daughter was waiting. And somewhere on a ranch in New Mexico, an old German shepherd named Max was finally home again after refusing to give up on finding his way back to the people he loved. Caleb started the truck engine slowly and turned north toward the highway, carrying with him the quiet understanding that sometimes the loneliest souls are only one act of kindness away from finding their way home too.